Begin this evening with number 742. Number 742. When upon like pillars you are 10 tall, when you are discouraged thinking all is lost, count your many blessings named one by one, and it will surprise you what the Lord has done. Count your blessings named one by one, count your blessings, see what God has done. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count the many blessings, see what God has done. Are you ever burdened with a load of care? Does the cross seem heavy you are called to bear? Count your many blessings, every down will fly, and you will be singing as the days go by. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God has done. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count the many blessings, see what God has done. So amid the conflict, whether great or small, do not be discouraged, God is over all. Count the many blessings, angels will attend, help and comfort give you till your journey's end. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God has done. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your many blessings, see what God has done. Let's mark our songbooks, number 753. Number 753.
Oh, good to see everyone here this evening. We thank you so very much for being here. Look around, I can't keep track. Look around. Oh, it's good to see y'all here, but we thank you so very much. Now would be a good time to silence all noise making devices so as not to interfere with the worship service and Bible study. There's a lot of information on the overhead update. Weaver Mills, as of 15, 20 minutes ago, no change from earlier this morning. They took him off the sedation medication and blood pressure's up, but a lot of his body functions are not where they should be. But he's responding to people with strictly ambulance. He is intubated, so he obviously cannot talk. Cannot visit him because he is in the acute cardiac care unit. So the family requested it, so is the hospital. Baptism. Sawyer Hobson put on Christ in baptism Tuesday, June the 11th. We need to give him a warm welcome into the fold. We need to let him know how proud we are of him, encourage him, and also encourage him knowing that the Lord is pleased with his decision. Ice cream supper will be on the 23rd following the evening worship in celebration of a high school graduate, Cameron Berry. Also, pizza and bottled water are on the menu, and we need cookies brought for this event also, if you can make and bring them.
Some used to it.
Oh,
Some used to it.
oh, good. Okay, you're right. Yeah, the 23rd is the ice cream season, so it's going to be a busy week. Let's see here. I've also got this note here. Last minute's change on the overhead. The van will leave here at 5:30 Monday. Going to Paris. It is Monday, right? Yeah. Okay. Going to Paris for the summer youth series also. Any other announcements? Let's go to our Father in prayer. Well, merciful Father, we give thanks to you for this beautiful day that you've given us and a bit of rain happening. We thank you so very much for all that you provide for us and know our needs. As we oftentimes have wants, but the needs are yours, and we depend upon you for those. We ask now that you look after those that are on the bed of affliction, comfort them, heal them, being thy will, comforting their families. But we especially want to remember Weaver Mills at this time, hope that he's able to recover and once again worship here. We thank you for Sawyer, who has responded to the gospel, and we ask that he has many years service, years of great service in your name. We also ask that we look after those that need special help and need to hear the word. We ask that you give us the strength to do the things that will bring honor and glory to you. But most of all, let us remember your Son, Jesus Christ, and the sacrifice he made on Calvary's cross on our behalf, so that we might have a home with you in heaven on that day of judgment. It's in Christ's name we ask and pray. Amen.
We're going to resume studying in the book of Job this evening. And in Job chapter 9, Job is responding to one of his friends when he asks him about, can man be righteous before God, is the key question that is being discussed. And Job's answer goes something like this. How can a man be righteous before God? Because you can't approach God. If you were to try to approach God, you would be so small and insignificant that basically you wouldn't be able to get a hearing so as to even demonstrate yourself to be righteous by any means at all. And one of the statements that Job makes is this, that there is no mediator between God and man. And in Job's time, that was the case. He said in Job 9 and verse 33, these words, "Nor is there any mediator between us who may lay his hand on us both." Now I think that's an interesting point that Job makes regarding man's relationship with God. At that time, man had no hope of having a mediator to stand before God on his behalf. And why was that? Because man was sinful. But as we know from the New Testament, Jesus came and he fulfilled one of Job's great desires. And that is for man to stand before God and to mediate, so as to present oneself righteous before God. In 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 5, the Apostle Paul writes this, "For there is one God and one mediator between God and man, the man, Christ Jesus." And what a blessing that is now that we have Jesus standing or sitting on the right hand of the throne of God there, able to mediate for us in our times of trouble. The book of Hebrews says, He ever lives to make intercession for us. And what a wonderful thought that is. Job did not have a mediator in his day and time, but today we have a mediator. And through Jesus then, we have the opportunity to stand before God. Not on our own power, not on our own ability, not on our own works that we might dream up, but rather upon the power, the ability, the works, and the person of Jesus Christ. And as He is standing there with us, then He can present us before God as being righteous. But this blessing is only for those who will call upon His name and live for Him. Have you called upon the name of Jesus Christ this evening by being baptized for the forgiveness of your sins? Maybe you need to do that this very hour so that you too can own Jesus as your mediator. Perhaps you need the prayers of the church. You need the mediating power of Jesus Christ to go before the Father and ask for help in your life. And if you need to make that request known this evening, we can help you with that also. Whatever your need may be, you come and make it known now while together we stand and sing.
And time will all things wonder why it should be thus all the day long, while there are others singing around us, never molested, though in the wrong. Are there alone will no fault about it? Are there alone will understand why? Cheer up, my brother, live in the sunshine. We'll understand it all by and by. When we see Jesus coming in glory, when He comes from His home in the sky, then we shall meet Him in that mansion. We'll understand it all by and by. Are there alone will know all about it? Are there alone will understand why? Cheer up, my brother, live in the sunshine. We'll understand it all by and by.
Our Heavenly Father, we thank Thee for this opportunity we have tonight to come together, study on a portion of Thy Word, sing these songs of praise to You. We ask that You be with the ones mentioned tonight, sick in his spirit, Brother Weaver, give him a speedy recovery if it be Thy will. We thank Thee, Heavenly Father, for Sawyer who baptized. We ask that You give us guidance that we may help him along and that he'll have a long and useful life of service in His kingdom. We pray, Heavenly Father, now as we dismiss from this auditorium, go to our classes, give the teachers a ready recollection of those things prepared. We as listeners take those things and apply them to their lives. Go into the community to be that example to bring forth Christ. We ask now that You guard, guide, direct our lives. Forgive us our sins. In Christ's name we pray. What's up, my man?
I'm always supposed to go there.
This is probably good. David, next guy to get this list. Brothers, Philip Houston, Robert West Miller. One of his daughters is a middle school coach. Anyway, he wound up there, almost in the same section. He had a spell and took him up there, and before they got through, he had two bypasses and a valve. But he's doing pretty well.
Okay.
Keep him on the list.
All right.
Philip Houston.
Philip Houston. Brother Russell Tyndall said Philip Houston, who is known to many here, had a double bypass and a valve replaced just yesterday, I guess.
Now this week,
This week. Okay.
yesterday or
So
last
we want to put him on the prayer list.
He's still there.
Yeah, he's in the ICU.
Yeah.
He is in ICU
Yeah,
also,
he's right down there, close to where we live.
close to Weaver. All right. Any other thoughts? Announcement wise? How's your day doing? Singing. Okay, good. Did we take him on prayer list? He's awesome. You did?
Poppy Bill for a while.
That is improving.
I don't know, they might have called though.
All right. Maybe so. Any other thoughts, comments? All right, well, let's get into the book of Job then, and open your Bibles to Job chapter 7. Job chapter 7. We were there a couple of weeks ago as we studied the book of Job. Well, 3 weeks ago, I think, because we had singing night, and then last week I was absent, and then this week we are going to pick up where we left off 3 weeks ago with Job chapter 7. And you recall that Job is responding to Eliphaz. And Eliphaz has brought out a criticism to Job, and Job has defended his complaint here in chapter 6. And one of the things he said in verse 14, one of the key verses, to him who is afflicted, kindness should be shown by his friend, even though he forsakes the fear of the Almighty. And so Job is asking for a little kindness instead of the criticism that he's receiving from Eliphaz. Now in chapter 7, he continues to bemoan his situation, saying that his complaint is perfectly natural and that he would be glad of death instead of suffering. And he continues to think that his death is going to occur very soon, that it's imminent. And then he interrogates his friends regarding their motives. Why are you criticizing me? Why are you leveling these charges against me? And why don't you just simply forgive me for whatever it is that you think that I have done? And that's in verses 17 and through 21 of chapter 7. Let's read those together and then we'll segue into chapter 8. What is man that you should exalt him, that you should set your heart on him, that you should visit him every morning and test him every moment? How long? Will you not look away from me and let me alone till I swallow my saliva? Have I sinned? What have I done to you, O watcher of men? Why have you set me as your target, so that I am a burden to myself? Why then do you not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity? For now I will lie down in the dust, and you will seek me diligently, but I will no longer be. Some commentators think that Job is speaking to God in these last few verses here and not to his friends. We don't have any direct evidence from the text that he is addressing his comments to God as of yet. Now, when we get into some later chapters, we will see that Job does begin to address God and ask God a bunch of questions about his circumstances and his situation. But it seems to me that he's still speaking to his friends here in verses 11 through 21 of chapter 7. And so one of the things he says, verse 13, when I say my bed will comfort me, my couch will ease my complaint, then you scare me with dreams and terrify me with visions. And you remember that in a previous chapter, Eliphaz talks about having a dream or a vision of sorts in chapter 4. And so it looks to me like, from the text, that Job is responding to Eliphaz and that he's not talking to God. Of course, the commentators seem to be split on that. So if you want to pursue studying the alternate interpretation of chapter 7, feel free to do that. But from my studies, it seems that he's still talking to his friends at this point, and that he has not yet directed his thoughts toward God. So his question in verse 20, I take as meaning that he is inquiring of his friends, have I sinned? And this is a question that he will continue to ask his friends over and over again. Tell me what my sin is. What have I done? Can you guys specifically say the sin that I've committed that's so great that supposedly it's brought all of this calamity upon me? And they're never able to do that. They're never able to bring forth any kind of evidence whatsoever that Job has sinned. Their only conviction regarding Job's sin is their doctrinal belief. And their doctrinal belief is that there is a one-to-one relationship between sin and suffering. So that if you are suffering just a little bit, then you committed a little sin. If you're suffering a medium bit, is there such a thing as a medium bit? Then you've committed a medium sin, And if you're suffering a whole lot, like Job is, then you, buddy, must have committed some whopper, of sin. And that's their only... They can't point out what Job's sin is. They can never say, Job, well, you did this or you did that. No, they just have their doctrinal belief to fall back on, that for every for suffering that you experience, there's a corresponding sin. And that's the only thing that they're going to bank on in their accusations against Job. And we're going to see them continue to hold to that position as they go forward in their communications with Job here. All right, so in verse 20, have I sinned? What have I done to you, O watcher of men? Seemingly addressing his friends. Why have you set me as your target? Again, the friends were targeting him here, so that I am a burden to myself. Why then do you not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity? And the idea being here, speaking to his friends, saying, why don't you just, if you think I've done some great sin, why don't you just forgive me and let it go, and then we can go on with having a normal human relationship instead of you leveling accusations against me while I'm suffering like this. But, of course, they're not going to do that. And so they don't. All right. Any questions about chapter 1 through 7? Well, let's get into chapter 8 then. And Bildad begins in chapter 8. And he argues that misfortune befalling the righteous perverts justice. In other words, that if a righteous person is suffering, that somehow that is unjust. And that God would never allow that to happen. Because if God allowed that to happen, that would be fair. It would be right, And, so many people today kind of hold that viewpoint of suffering. And they have the idea, well, what have I done wrong gain to all of this suffering that's going on in my life? And they're asking the wrong question. Because suffering doesn't just befall people who have done wrong. It also befalls people who have lived their lives in a good way as well. And Job is going to eventually make that point. But of course, they believe that God is the one who inflicts suffering on people, and that it's God who is responsible then for Job's current situation. And there's a sense in which they're right. God is responsible for everything in the sense that He created it and He set it all in motion, right? But there's this thing called free will. And He has given free will both to His non-human created beings, such as angels and those who fell, like Satan and other demons perhaps, and He's given free will to men as well. And so when free will comes into place, then guess what? The person who makes the choice becomes responsible for their choice in regard to whatever it is that they set in motion. And they will be held responsible and accountable for that choice. And so in this case, while God is responsible for setting everything in motion, so to speak, it was Satan who set in motion the suffering that Job is now experiencing. And that's what neither Job nor his friends understand. They think, well, only God could be capable of creating such a catastrophe or calamity in a person's life like this. And one of the things the book of Job tells us is, it's not just God who's responsible for what goes on in the world. It is others who have free will and who can then make their own decisions that are responsible for the consequences of those decisions, such as suffering and things like that. All right. So look verses 1 through 7 of chapter 8. Bildad contends that bad things don't happen to the righteous. Look what he says. Then Bildad the Shuhite answered and said, by the way, who was the shortest man in the Bible? Bildad. He was only Shuhite. That's bad. I don't think of those things unless I really get a cue. But anyway. All right. Bildad the Shuhite. Okay. All right. Verse 2. This is what he said. How long will you speak these things, and the words of your mouth be like a strong wind? So look at how he's starting out here. You thought Eliphaz was laying it on pretty thick with Job? Well, Bildad's going to show him up, as far as taking on Job's words. Strong. In other words, Job, you're just full of hot air, basically, is what he's saying. Verse 3. Does God subvert judgment, or does the Almighty pervert justice? If your sons have sinned against Him, He has cast them away for their transgression. Well, He didn't hold anything back there, did He? What happened to Job's sons? Well, we learned in chapter 1, they died, didn't they? Well, Job, guess what? Your sons died because they sinned against God, and God was punishing them. That is just flat out ornery, isn't it? To say something like that. But that's what he said here. Does God subvert judgment, or the Almighty pervert justice? Of course, God doesn't subvert judgment. He doesn't pervert justice. But in their scheme of thinking, if there's some suffering that's going on that hadn't had any associated sin with it, then that is a subversion of justice. Because they believe God is directly inflicting that suffering, and it's done for a reason, for sin, because people have sinned or something like that. And so, to have somebody afflicted who had not sinned, in Bildad's view, would be a subversion of justice. It would be a perverting of judgment. And that's why he asks this question in verse 3. Does God subvert judgment, or does the Almighty pervert justice? Now look at what he says in verse 5 to Job. If you would earnestly seek God and make your supplication to the Almighty, if you were pure and upright, surely now he would await for you and prosper your rightful dwelling place. Though your beginning was small, yet your latter end would increase abundantly. By Job, all you need to do, and this is sort of an echo of what Eliphaz said, all you need to do is fess up to this great sin that you committed, and then God will take everything away. You know, awful generous of him to make that offer, isn't it? But of course, Job hasn't done anything. And so why would Job want to just simply confess to some great sin just to salve his friend's conscience and to sort of undergird their false doctrinal beliefs? Because that's in essence what would happen if he did that. You see, if Job were to say, okay guys, you got me. I committed a whopper. Oh boy, I'm so sorry for it. And I'm going to ask God for forgiveness. Then what happens? Then the friends say, oh, you see, we were right. We were right all along. Our doctrine is pure. Our doctrine is correct. And so, in doing that, basically, Job would... I'm trying to find a word here. He would basically support their false doctrinal beliefs. Right? So,
Substantiate their righteous indignation.
yeah, and substantiate their false righteousness, their self-righteousness, more or less. That wasn't the word I was looking for, but it's good. That's a good one. But anyway, enable them. He would enable them. All right, that's the word I was looking for. He would enable their belief in this false doctrine that they have. And Job has too much character to do that. Yes?
Well, something I've said this, it indicates that during this time that Job knew he had done it, but he's being talked to that he has done something. And if he goes and takes over, believes what they're telling him, then he's asking, then why is God, then it says, then God is unjust. That's what he's going to. If he believes what they're telling him is true, then God's unjust because he hasn't done anything. So that's going to his, what is going through his mind also.
Yes, and Job has a lot of questions. I mean, he basically believed the same thing that his friends believed. He's going to say that here in a minute.
But he hadn't done anything.
But he hasn't done anything. And so he's going to start to question this doctrinal belief that he has held prior to this point. And this is one of the great points of the book of Job, is that, and I want to be very clear about this, is that when our experience comes into conflict with our doctrinal belief, we have a crisis of faith. Okay? We have a crisis of faith. And so that's why it's so important for us to believe the right things. Because if we don't believe the right things, our experience will conflict with the false beliefs that we have. And when that experience conflicts with those false beliefs, then we're going to give up on those beliefs and we're going to look for other beliefs. And so that's something that the book of Job is teaching very clearly, is that for those doctrinal beliefs that we sort of assume, let's say, for the sake of argument, we assume these doctrinal beliefs. When experience conflicts with those beliefs, we need to give up those beliefs and think about things in a different way. Now, we may not have a lot of tools on how to do that sometimes, and it may be a challenge for us to work through those things. But eventually we'll come to the point where I believe if we stick with it, we continue to have faith in God and faith in His Son Jesus Christ, we don't give up, we'll eventually come to a point where we'll have a sort of a refreshed and renewed insight into things, and that things will be more nuanced for us at that point. Because a lot of times what we do is we make generic, just broad, we just paint things with a broad brush, all right? We do that a lot. And we do that because, frankly, it makes us feel good. We want to think that the world is a nice, neat place that is very easily defined, and we have this broad brush over here. We just paint everything with this broad brush and say, see, that's how the world works. But the truth of the matter is that the world is very nuanced. The world is very detailed. And that the broad brush that we paint things with isn't always the right thing to do. Instead of painting, we're actually whitewashing. That's what we're doing. And we end up covering over something that we ought to pay attention to. And when we cover over it, and then our experience contradicts our painting that we've created over here, then guess what? We're going to say, well, maybe this painting isn't right. And we might begin to question God at that point. But it's not God's fault. It's our fault. Why? Because we painted the world the wrong way. Okay? So we've got to go back and think about what we believed and repaint in the way that we're supposed to, according to God's will. All right? Well, I don't know if that made a lot of sense to y'all. But that's kind of what Job is doing here in this context. All right, let's continue on to verse 8 then. Now, this is still Bildad speaking. For inquire, please, of the former age. Now, you remember that Eliphaz appealed to his vision, all right? His personal experience. So he appealed to personal experience to establish his doctrine, okay? And that's one of the great lessons here is that personal experience is not sufficient to establish truth. Okay? It's just not. But Bildad is going to appeal to tradition. Okay? And he's going to say why. Tradition tells us these things are true. Look at what he says here. Inquire, please, of the former age, verse 8, and consider the things discovered by their fathers. Right? So look at all the things that happened before our time by our forefathers. Our tradition, Job, it's got to be right. For we were born yesterday and know nothing, because our days on the earth are a shadow. Will they not teach you and tell you and utter words from their heart? That is, Job, our experience here in this life is so limited. Is, from the standpoint of comparing our lives to all of time that's come before us, why, we've just had a very brief stay here. So we've got to depend upon our forefathers in order to teach us the lessons that they learned. And one of those lessons that they learned is this, Job, that for every sin that a person commits, there is a corresponding suffering that goes with it, right? That's what he's trying to say, basically. But we're limited. Verse 10, will they, that is the forefathers, not teach you and tell you and utter words from their heart? Now here's some of these are kind of weird because we don't just quite understand the figures, the metaphors that he's using here. And we don't live in the same culture, but he gives some specific proverbs that evidently were fairly popular in that particular day and time. And here they are. Listen, of course, in verse 11 and following. Can the papyrus grow up without a marsh? Can the reeds flourish without water? While it is yet green and not cut down, it withers before any other plant. So are the paths of all who forget God. You see? Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense to us because we don't live in that culture. But basically, he's trying to support and bolster this doctrine that he's appealing to. Just like reeds wither and are cut down when they don't have the appropriate support that they need, then so also people who sin they wither and they cut down. That's basically what he's trying to say here. And we don't quite understand the papyrus and the reed and that kind of illustration because we have different illustration. But look at the rest of verse 13. And the hope of the hypocrite shall perish, whose confidence shall be cut off, and whose trust is as a spider's web. Well, we kind of get that a little bit. He leans on his house, but it does not stand. He holds it fast, but it does not endure. He grows green in the sun, and his branches spread out in his garden. His roots wrap around the rock heap, and look for a place in the stones. If he is destroyed from his place, then it will deny him, saying, I have not seen you. So, now, Bildad is developing the argument a little bit here. And you're going to see that eventually it will take on this tone. And they will say, well, Job, you're somewhat right. Somewhat. Yes, maybe the wicked will flourish for a little bit. Like a grass that grows green in the sun for a little bit, and the branches spread out, the roots wrap around the rock, and then guess what? Well, it gets cut off of its nourishment and water, and it dries up. Maybe the wicked will prosper for a little bit, but ultimately they are going to be cast down. They're going to wither away. They're going to be cut off. Verse 19, behold, this is the joy of his way, and out of the earth others will grow. Behold, God will not cast away the blameless, nor will he uphold the evildoers. He will yet fill your mouth with laughing, and your lips with rejoicing. Those who hate you will be clothed with shame, and the dwelling place of the wicked will come to nothing. So here in his final appeal to Job, he says this, Job, this is God's plan, basically. This is what makes God rejoice. And what is that? That he rewards the righteous and that he punishes the wicked. He rewards the righteous with good things, with all kinds of possessions and good feelings and things like that. And he punishes the wicked with suffering and poverty and those sorts of things, is what he's saying. God will not cast away the blameless, he says in verse 20. Nor will he uphold the evildoers. And you see, that's what Bildad thinks is going on with Job. He thinks that God is upholding Job as an evildoer. And if God does that, then guess what? He's perverted justice, according to Bildad. All right? All right. Any questions or comments? Chapter 8. Anybody? Key verse of chapter 8 is verse 3. Does God pervert judgment, or does the Almighty pervert justice? And of course, God does not pervert judgment. He does not pervert justice. He is perfectly righteous. Genesis 18, verse 25, Abraham asked the question, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Yes, God will always do what is right. But maybe your conception of God is not right. Okay? And that's the problem that Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar have here. It's not that they're wrong in saying that God won't pervert justice. They're wrong in thinking that this particular situation is that principle applies to this situation. That's where they're wrong. All right. All right, let's move on to chapter 9 here. Chapter 9. Job argues that misfortune befalls both the righteous and the wicked. All right, let's look at verses 1 through 12. Then Job answered and said, truly I know it is so. In other words, hey guys, I believe the same thing you do. what you're saying is right. God doesn't pervert justice. He doesn't cast away the righteous. And then he's going to say, and I have no idea what's going on. Basically. He agrees with them. Now he says this, but how can a man be righteous before God? Now that's one of the key questions of this chapter. How can a man be righteous before God? And we've got to understand Job's concept of righteousness, all right? Today, our concept of righteousness is defined by Jesus and who he was, all right? But in this day and time, their conception of righteousness was not defined in that way. It was defined by the idea or the concept of going to court and being exonerated in a court of law or amongst the judges of the day and age, okay? If you are a righteous person, that meant that your life was exonerated by those who stood in judgment. All right? Now, that's a little different way to think about it than what we think about it. But that's how they thought about it. And so, when Job asked the question, how can a man be righteous before God? He has, within his mind and in his thoughts, this picture of a man standing before the judge, God, and pleading a case to him. All right? And his question is, how do you do that? How do you plead your case with God? And he's going to continue to ask that question over and over again in the book of Job. Because he wants to know how that's done. And he's going to keep asking that question as we go through the book. Now, toward the end of Job's statements, he's finally going to actually demand an audience with God. And he crosses the line when he does that. Now, so far, this is just my thought about it. You're free to develop your own thought about this. But so far, I don't think that Job has said anything or done anything that would be construed to be sinful in his words at this point. But eventually, he's going to make demands of God. At that point, he has crossed the line. But he's not there yet. But he will get there. All right. So how can a man be righteous before God? It's okay to ask a question like that. There's nothing wrong with that. Verse 3. If one wished to contend with him, and again, you have to take the legal picture into question here when he uses words like contend and things like that. He's not talking about, mixing it up with God with a fist fight or something like that. He's talking about going to court and pleading his case. If one wished to contend with him, he cannot answer him one time out of 1,000. And remember, in this day and time, courtrooms were different from ours. In our courtroom, we have a judge who's supposed to be impartial, and then we have sort of we call it the adversarial system, right? Two people, one to advocate against the plaintiff and one to defend the plaintiff. And then the judge kind of sits back and listens to both arguments and, makes a decision, or the jury does, whatever. But in that day and time, it was more like our Supreme Court, okay, where the judges ask the questions. And the ones who are making the plea are the ones who set forth the defense for themselves. And so in a court situation, this day and time, the judges were the ones who examined and who tried and who asked and who probed. And then it was the burden of the person who was appearing before the judges to make the defense. So it's a little bit different system than what we're used to. But that's the system that Job is dealing with here. And that's what he says. If one wished to contend with him, he could not answer him one time out of 1,000. Verse 4. God is wise in heart and mighty in strength, who hath hardened himself against him and prospered. He removes the mountains, and they do not know when he overturns them in his anger. He shakes the earth out of its place, and its pillars tremble. He commands the sun, and it does not rise. He seals off stars. He alone spreads out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. He made the bear, Orion, and the Pleiades, and the chambers of the south. He does great things past finding out. Yes, wonders without number. If he goes by me, I do not see him. If he moves past, I do not perceive him. If he takes away, who can hinder him? Who can say to him, what are you doing? God will not withdraw his anger. The allies of the proud lie prostrate beneath him. So, in essence, what Job is saying is that, look, God is so far above and beyond me that it would be a pointless thing to try to appear before him and defend myself. Because God's wisdom is infinite, his power is infinite, and his knowledge is infinite. How would I be able to stand before such a judge? And the answer is, Job, you wouldn't. You wouldn't be able to stand before such a judge. The only thing that you can do when you stand before God is plead for mercy. That's it. So look at what Job continues to say here in verse 14. So Job asks God if he knows. Oh no, I'm sorry, I'm moving ahead. Job asks how man can have justice before the Almighty. 13 through 14, Job says, God must give calamity to both the innocent and the wicked. Alright, verse 14. How then can I answer him and choose my words to reason with him? For though I were righteous, I could not answer him. I would beg mercy of my judge. So there's what I said a minute ago. You can only beg for mercy. Verse 16. If I called and he answered me, I would not believe that he was listening to my voice. For he crushes me with a tempest and multiplies my wounds without cause. He will not allow me to catch my breath, but fills me with bitterness. It is a matter of strength, indeed. He is strong. And if of justice, who will appoint my day in court? Though I were righteous, my own mouth would condemn me. Though I were blameless, it would prove me perverse. In other words, what Job is saying here basically is this. Right now, God is bringing all this calamity upon me. And how could I appear before him, even with what I've got going on right now? How could that happen? There's no way I'd be able to make even an argument. The best thing I could do is ask for mercy, and if I were to try to say something, why, my own mouth would condemn me. And God would know it as soon as I tried to make a defense. Now look at verse 21. So, Job, however, is not giving up on his innocence here. He says, I am blameless, yet I do not know myself. I despise my life. That is, he doesn't know himself in the sense that he used to because of his disease, how it has afflicted him. I despise my life. It is all one thing. Therefore I say, he destroys the blameless and the wicked. If the scourge slay, that's a key verse, by the way, verse 22. He destroys the blameless and the wicked. If the scourge slay suddenly, he laughs at the plight of the innocent. The earth is given into the hand of the wicked. He covers the faces of its judges. It is not he, who else could it be? That's a pretty good question, too, there at the end, isn't it? In other words, if God's not doing this, then who's doing it? He doesn't know it, you see. But we do. We have a little insight that somebody else is doing it. But anyway, key verse 22, it is all one thing. What does he mean by that? He means that the suffering of the righteous and the suffering of the wicked is equal. And that's what he says in the next line there. He destroys the blameless and the wicked. That is, equally. That must be what's going on. Now this is Job's conclusion without the benefit of inspiration, okay? And so what he concludes is that, well, you know what, guys? Since I haven't committed this big whopping sin that you said I committed, it must be the case that the blameless get destroyed, and that the guilty get destroyed as well. That both of them get destroyed. And God just does it the same to both of them. It's all one thing. And so that's where Job's at this point. And so now, in this chapter, he moves away from the doctrine that Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar are holding, that is that God only afflicts the guilty, and that he only blesses the righteous. And Job is now taking the position that, no, it looks to me like God afflicts both the righteous and the wicked because of my situation. And basically what he's done is he's taken his experience and he said, you know what? I can't hold on to this doctrinal belief anymore that God only afflicts the wicked. I've got to let go of that now. And I've got to move to a different belief. And so his belief changes in this situation. Question. When you go through a lot of suffering, do your beliefs change? What do you think? Some of you have gone through a lot of suffering. Some of you not as much. Your beliefs do change. Now, I'm not saying that your belief in God changes or your belief in Jesus or the church or anything like that. But you begin to question things. You begin to ask, well, do I really believe this or not? Am I really going to hold on to this belief that I had before? And we start to develop a more nuanced picture of the world than what we held previously. You see, suffering has a good place in the world. And although we don't like to go through it, God has allowed it and put it into the world for our benefit, to help us revise our beliefs, to help us revise our character, to help us revise our practices, and to help us to see when we've done things wrong. You know, just like if I get a pain from, let's say I take a butcher knife. I'm going to get to you, Ray, just a second. I got a lot of thoughts right now. If I take a butcher knife and cut my finger like that, it's going to hurt, isn't it? Why does it hurt? It hurts because God has designed my body to say, hey, when you get pain, something is wrong. Right? And when I cut my finger, if I'm chopping up a bunch of onions or something, and I slice my finger, it's going to hurt. And I'm going to, wow. And immediately I'm going to know something is wrong. How do I know something is wrong? Because I have this pain. Well, guess what, folks? Emotional pain works the same way. When we have a tremendous emotional pain, then we know something is wrong. Something's not the way it's supposed to be. And we would do well to investigate that, to see, well, what is it that's wrong here? Maybe I need to change and be someone different than I have been in the past. Okay, Ray, go ahead.
I'm just going to comment here. It's similar to what you said. I think when situations happen to us, we either going to do two things. We're either going to go away from God or we're going to get closer to God. And of course, it depends on what happens to the people in that situation. But they're not going to stay neutral. They're going to get closer or go away. You know, they're going to blame God, or they're going to try to focus on God to relieve that problem.
Well, if you're already predisposed to go to extremes, okay, to one extreme or another, then you're probably going to leave God. Because you're a person who just goes to extremes. But God is trying to say, no, look, that's not the right response. The right response is not to go to extreme, but to reevaluate and to think about what your beliefs are and to put a finer edge to them so that you really know what it is you believe. That's really what needs to be done. But so many people today, they're just, one extreme or another. That's all they'll do. And if you can't find any middle. So, all right, we got to stop. Thanks for your good comments tonight. God bless you.